What happens when you deliberately wear your ugliest gown to drive away your father's guest, only to discover he's the one man who's haunted your dreams for 3 years? Georgiana Hartwell thought she had a plan. She thought she was safe. But the moment Duke Thomas Ashford walked through her door, everything she believed about control, about fate, about the walls around her heart, shattered. If you love slow-burn Regency romance with forbidden desire and impossible choices, subscribe now and comment where you're watching from. This is a story you won't forget. Georgiana Hartwell had chosen the most hideous dress in her wardrobe with deliberate precision. The gown hung like a sack over her frame, a murky shade of brown that made her skin look sallow in the afternoon light filtering through her chamber window. The neckline sat too high, the sleeves too short, the hem uneven where moths had nibbled at the fabric. Her maid, sweet, loyal Mary, had actually gasped when Georgiana pulled it from the depths of the armoire. "Miss, surely not that one," Mary had pleaded, her round face creased with concern. "Your father's guest, he's meant to be quite important." Important. The word tasted bitter on Georgiana's tongue as she studied her reflection in the looking-glass. That was precisely the point. Her father had been unbearably cheerful at breakfast, dropping hints like stones into still water. A distinguished visitor. A man of considerable standing. "Someone you'll want to impress, my dear." Each word had landed with the weight of expectation, of matrimonial scheming barely concealed behind paternal smiles. Georgiana had smiled back, serene as a painted Madonna, and then she'd come upstairs and selected this monstrosity. "This one will do perfectly, Mary," she said now, smoothing the rough fabric over her waist. The dress did nothing for her figure, which was rather the point. "I have no interest in impressing father's guest." Mary's mouth opened, then closed. She knew better than to argue when Georgiana's jaw set in that particular way, when her green eyes went hard as river stones. Instead, she simply sighed and began pinning Georgiana's dark auburn hair into the most severe, unflattering style she could manage, another deliberate choice. The reflection staring back at Georgiana looked like a particularly dour governess. Perfect. She ignored the small, traitorous flutter in her chest, the one that whispered she might regret this, that perhaps her father's guest might be someone unexpected, someone... No. She crushed that thought before it could fully form. She'd learned her lesson about hope 3 years ago, at the Havisham spring ball. She'd learned it in the way a certain dark-haired duke had looked straight through her when she'd been introduced, his blue eyes distant and cold, his bow perfunctory. The Duke of Wycliffe had the kind of face that belonged in Italian paintings, all sharp angles and aristocratic beauty that made something in her chest ache just looking at him. But he'd smiled at her the way one smiles at furniture, polite, empty, forgetting her the instant he turned away. Georgiana had gone home that night and cried into her pillow like a foolish child. She'd vowed never to be that foolish again. "There," Mary said softly, tucking the last pin into place. You look like you're ready. Ready to disappoint her father. Ready to repel whatever fortune-hunting lord or aging widower he'd dragged to their modest estate in the heart of Derbyshire. Ready to protect herself from another moment of heart-crushing insignificance. Georgiana descended the stairs with her spine straight, her expression composed. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of Hartwell House, catching motes of dust that danced in the air like tiny stars. Below, she could hear her father's voice in the drawing room, warm and animated. He was laughing, a good sign that his guest had arrived, that the performance was already underway. Her hand tightened on the banister. The last time her father had schemed this, obviously, he'd invited Lord Pembridge, a man twice her age with wandering hands and breath that smelled of onions. Georgiana had endured one dinner before claiming a sudden migraine. Her father hadn't spoken to her for a week. Well, he could add another week of silence to his tally. She reached the bottom of the stairs and paused before the drawing-room door, which stood slightly ajar. Through the gap she could see her father's profile, his greying hair catching the light, his face animated with pleasure. And beside him, her heart stopped. She couldn't see the guest's face from this angle, just the line of a broad shoulder in a perfectly tailored coat, the colour of midnight, the edge of a strong jaw, dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. But something about the way he stood, the unconscious command in his posture, the elegant angle of his head as he listened to her father speak, made her throat go dry. No, it couldn't be. But her body already knew. Her pulse had already quickened, her palms already damp beneath her hideous brown sleeves. That ache in her chest, the one she thought she'd successfully buried 3 years ago, flared back to life like embers touched by wind. She pressed one hand against her stomach, willing herself to breathe, to think. She was being absurd. There were hundreds of aristocratic men in England with good posture and dark hair. The chances of her father somehow— "Georgiana!" Her father's voice rang out cheerfully. He must have spotted her through the gap in the door. "Come in, my dear. Come meet our guest." There was no escape now, no graceful retreat. Georgiana pushed the door open and stepped into the drawing room, her chin lifted, her expression carefully neutral. She kept her eyes on her father as she crossed the threshold, delaying the inevitable moment of— "Your Grace," her father was saying, turning toward his guest with obvious pride, "may I present my daughter, Miss Georgiana Hartwell. Georgiana, this is His Grace, the Duke of Wycliffe." The world tilted sideways. Georgiana's gaze swung to the man standing beside the fireplace, and every carefully constructed wall she'd built around her heart crumbled to dust in an instant. It was him. Thomas Ashford, Duke of Wycliffe, stood less than 10 feet away from her, and he was somehow more devastating than her memories had painted him. 3 years had added depth to his features, a harder edge to his jaw, a knowing weight to those impossibly blue eyes that seemed to see straight through skin and bone into the terrified core of her. He wore his dark hair slightly longer now, swept back from a face that could make angels weep. His cravat was tied in an intricate knot, his waistcoat a subtle grey that probably cost more than her entire wardrobe. He was perfect, untouchable, and he was looking directly at her. For one suspended moment, neither of them moved. Georgiana felt pinned beneath his gaze like a butterfly under glass, unable to breathe, unable to think beyond the horrifying realization that she was standing before the man she'd dreamed about for 3 years wearing the ugliest dress in England. His eyes swept over her, once quickly, and she saw it. The tiny flicker of surprise, the almost imperceptible widening of his pupils. And then something else, something she couldn't name, that made heat crawl up her neck in a mortifying wave. "Miss Hartwell." His voice was deep, cultured, with a roughness beneath the polish that she didn't remember from their first meeting. He bowed, the movement fluid and precise. "It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance." Make your acquaintance, as if they'd never met before, as if she'd never existed at all in his memory. The pain of it lanced through her chest, sharp and clean. "Your Grace." She curtsied, years of training keeping her voice steady even as her world splintered apart. "The pleasure is mine." A lie. Everything about this moment was a lie, wrapped in politeness, in social convention, in the hideous brown dress that now felt like both armor and humiliation. Her father beamed, oblivious. "His Grace has come all the way from London. We were just discussing the new drainage systems being implemented on his northern estates." Fascinating stuff, truly fascinating. Georgiana barely heard him. She was too aware of the Duke's eyes on her, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. What was he thinking? Was he wondering why she looked like she'd dressed in the dark? Was he already regretting accepting her father's invitation? Good. Let him regret it. Let him leave and forget her all over again. "Your father tells me you're quite accomplished at the pianoforte," the Duke said, and there was something in his tone, a thread of genuine curiosity that caught her off guard. "I play adequately," Georgiana managed, hating how breathless she sounded. "She's being modest," her father interjected proudly. "Georgiana has quite a gift. Perhaps you might play for us after dinner, my dear." Dinner. He was staying for dinner. Of course he was. Georgiana felt the walls closing in, the trap of her father's machinations tightening around her with each passing second. The Duke was still watching her, his expression unreadable, and she realized with sinking horror that she would have to endure hours of this, hours of sitting across from the man who haunted her dreams, while wearing a dress that made her look like a mud puddle. "I would be honored to hear you play," the Duke said quietly, and for just a moment his eyes met hers with something that looked almost like recognition, understanding. No, she was imagining things, projecting desperate hopes onto a man who barely knew she existed. Georgiana forced a smile, the kind she'd perfected over years of disappointing suitors and tedious social calls. "Then I shall play, Your Grace, though I fear you may find my skills less impressive than my father suggests." "I doubt that very much, Miss Hartwell," he replied, and the way he said her name, low and deliberate as if he were tasting each syllable, sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. She looked away quickly, fixing her gaze on the window, on the safe, familiar view of the gardens beyond. Anything to escape the weight of his attention, the confusing tangle of emotions knotting in her chest. This was a disaster. A beautiful, terrible disaster, and she had no idea how she was going to survive it. Dinner was a particular kind of torture Georgiana had not anticipated. She sat across from the Duke of Wycliffe, at the modest dining table, candlelight flickering between them like a living thing, casting shadows that danced across his aristocratic features. Her father had positioned them this way deliberately, of course he had, so that she had no choice but to meet Thomas's eyes every time she lifted her gaze from her plate. And he was looking at her, constantly. Not in the polite, distracted way men usually looked at women during formal dinners, not with the glazed expression of someone mentally tallying their investments or planning their escape. No. The Duke watched her with an intensity that made her hands tremble as she reached for her wineglass, made her throat tighten around every bite of roasted pheasant. It was unnerving, it was impossible, and it made absolutely no sense. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice cutting smoothly through her father's rambling monologue about crop rotations, "your father mentioned you enjoy reading. What sorts of books capture your interest?" Georgiana's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She set it down carefully, buying herself a moment to gather her scattered thoughts. Why was he asking her this? Why was he bothering to engage her in conversation when he'd forgotten her existence entirely 3 years ago? "I read widely, Your Grace," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. "Poetry, philosophy, the occasional novel when I can acquire one." His eyebrow lifted, just slightly, but she caught it. "The occasional novel? Your tone suggests you find them difficult to obtain. My father believes novels are frivolous." The words came out more sharply than she'd intended. Across the table, her father's jovial expression flickered with displeasure. "Now, Georgiana," he said with a forced laugh, "I merely suggested that a young lady's time might be better spent on more edifying pursuits." "I disagree." The Duke's voice was quiet, but it cut through her father's protest like a blade through silk. Both Georgiana and her father stared at him. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his long fingers wrapped around the stem of his wineglass, his gaze fixed on Georgiana with unreadable intensity. "Novels teach us empathy. They allow us to live 1,000 lives we would never otherwise experience. I would argue there are few pursuits more edifying than that." Georgiana's heart stuttered in her chest. She searched his face for mockery, for the polite condescension she'd come to expect from men of his station. But his expression remained serious, almost thoughtful, as if he genuinely cared about her answer. It made no sense. None of this made sense. Yes, she managed, hating how breathless she sounded. "Yes, exactly." Something flickered in his eyes. Approval, pleasure, and he inclined his head slightly. "Then perhaps you might recommend something for me to read, Miss Hartwell. I find myself in need of a good story." Her father beamed, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension crackling between them like summer lightning. "Wonderful. You see, Georgiana, His Grace is a man of culture and learning. You two shall get along splendidly." Georgiana barely heard him. She was too focused on the way Thomas was looking at her, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle, as if she were something rare and unexpected that had appeared in his path. It made her feel exposed, vulnerable. And beneath the fear and confusion, something warm and dangerous was unfurling in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. She crushed it ruthlessly. "I would be happy to provide a list of recommendations, Your Grace," she said coolly, reaching for her wineglass. Her fingers brushed against the stem and she forced them to steady. though I imagine your library in London far exceeds our modest collection." "Perhaps," he said softly, and there was something in his tone, a gentleness that made her throat ache. "But a recommendation from someone who reads with passion is worth more than 1,000 volumes gathering dust on a shelf." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning she didn't dare examine. Georgiana took a sip of wine, using the moment to compose herself, to rebuild the walls he kept dismantling with every word, every glance. Her father, sensing an opportunity, launched into an enthusiastic description of the local lending library, which was really just a single shelf in the village vicar's study, and Georgiana seized the chance to study the Duke while his attention was diverted. He listened to her father with apparent interest, nodding at appropriate intervals, but she caught the subtle signs of a mind working elsewhere, the slight tension in his jaw, the way his thumb traced idle patterns against his wineglass, the occasional flicker of his gaze in her direction, quick as a breath before returning to her father's animated face. What was he thinking? What could he possibly want from her? The hideous brown dress suddenly felt like a costume in a play she didn't understand. She'd worn it to repel him, to ensure he found her dull and unremarkable. But instead of disgust or indifference, she saw only curiosity, interest, as if the dress made her more intriguing rather than less. It was maddening. "His Grace has asked to extend his stay," her father announced suddenly, and Georgiana's attention snapped back to the conversation with the force of a slap. "I've invited him to remain with us for the week. Isn't that wonderful news, my dear?" No, it was not wonderful news. It was a catastrophe of epic proportions. "A week!" The words escaped before she could stop them, pitched slightly too high, slightly too alarmed. Thomas's eyes found hers across the table, and for just a moment she saw something flash in their blue depths, amusement, concern, before his expression smoothed into polite neutrality. "If it's not an imposition," he said, still looking at her rather than her father, "I confess I find the countryside far more appealing than I'd anticipated, and your father has been most generous with his hospitality." "Look at father," she wanted to shout. "I'm not the one offering you hospitality. I'm not the one who wants you here." But that would be a lie, wouldn't it? Some treacherous part of her, the part that had cried into her pillow 3 years ago, the part that had never quite stopped hoping, wanted him here desperately, wanted the chance to understand why he was looking at her like she mattered, like she was someone worth remembering. "It's no imposition at all, Your Grace," her father said warmly. "We're delighted to have you." "Aren't we, Georgiana?" She forced her lips into something approximating a smile. "Of course, father, delighted." The word tasted like ash in her mouth. The rest of dinner passed in a blur of forced pleasantries and increasingly desperate attempts to avoid Thomas's gaze. But it was impossible. She felt his attention like heat from a fire, constant and inescapable. When she lifted her fork, she sensed his eyes following the movement. When she spoke, she felt him listening with an intensity that suggested her words mattered far more than they should. It was exhausting. It was intoxicating. And it made her want to scream. Finally, mercifully, her father pushed back from the table and suggested they adjourn to the drawing room for tea and music. Georgiana stood on unsteady legs, her heart hammering against her ribs as she smoothed her hideous brown skirts with damp palms. "Miss Hartwell," Thomas said quietly, appearing at her elbow with unnerving swiftness, "might I have the honor of escorting you?" He offered his arm, and Georgiana stared at it as if he'd offered her a live serpent. The dark fabric of his coat looked impossibly fine against the candlelight, and she could see the subtle play of muscle beneath it, strength carefully contained. She didn't want to touch him. She couldn't bear to touch him. But refusing would be unforgivably rude, and her father was already beaming at them from across the table, his matchmaking schemes practically written across his face in letters of fire. Slowly, carefully, Georgiana placed her hand on the Duke's arm. The contact sent a shock through her system like touching ice and flame simultaneously. Even through the layers of fabric, her glove, his coat, his shirt, she could feel the solid warmth of him, the barely leashed power. His arm tensed beneath her fingers just slightly, and she wondered if he felt it too. this strange electric current that seemed to arc between them. "Thank you, Your Grace," she murmured, not meeting his eyes. They walked in silence toward the drawing room, her father trailing behind them, still chattering about something inconsequential. Georgiana was hyper-aware of every point of contact, her hand on his arm, the careful distance he maintained between them, the scent of him that made her think of leather and wood smoke and something darker she couldn't name. "You're afraid of me," he said suddenly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. Georgiana's steps faltered. She forced herself to keep walking, to keep her expression neutral, even as her heart lurched. "I don't know what you mean, Your Grace." "Don't you?" He glanced down at her, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "You've barely looked at me all evening. You flinch every time I speak to you. Either I've done something to offend you profoundly, or—" He trailed off, leaving the sentence hanging between them like smoke. "Or?" She couldn't help herself. The word escaped before her better judgment could stop it. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. They'd reached the drawing-room threshold, but he paused just outside, turning to face her fully. Her father had been waylaid by a servant with some household question, leaving them momentarily alone in the corridor. The candlelight painted shadows across the Duke's face, making him look like something from a dream, beautiful and unreal. "Or you're afraid of something else entirely," he said softly. His eyes searched hers, and she felt stripped bare beneath that gaze, all her careful defenses rendered useless. "Something that has nothing to do with me, and everything to do with what you're feeling." The words hit her like a physical blow. She stepped back, breaking contact, her hand falling from his arm as if burned. "You presume too much, Your Grace," she said, and she was proud of how steady her voice sounded despite the chaos raging inside her. "I am not afraid of you. I'm not afraid of anything." It was a lie. They both knew it was a lie. Thomas studied her for another long moment, and something in his expression shifted, softened in a way that made her chest ache. "Forgive me," he said quietly. "It seems I have a habit of overstepping with you, Miss Hartwell." Before she could respond, before she could even begin to untangle what he meant by that, her father appeared at the drawing-room door, ushering them inside with cheerful insistence. Georgiana moved mechanically to the pianoforte in the corner, grateful for the excuse to put distance between herself and the Duke. Her hands were shaking as she settled onto the bench, smoothing her skirts, arranging the sheet music with movements that had nothing to do with preparation and everything to do with buying herself time to breathe. She could feel Thomas watching her from across the room, could feel the weight of his attention like a physical touch. And when she finally placed her fingers on the keys and began to play, a melancholy piece by Mozart that she knew by heart, she poured every confused, desperate emotion into the music. Let the notes speak what she couldn't say aloud. The room fell silent, except for the piano. Even her father stopped his incessant chattering, drawn into the spell of the melody. But Georgiana was only aware of one thing: the Duke, standing by the fireplace, his expression unreadable as he listened, and the way his hands clenched slightly at his sides, as if he were fighting the urge to reach for something he shouldn't want. Georgiana did not sleep. She lay in her bed as moonlight crept across the floorboards, replaying every moment of the evening in excruciating detail. The way Thomas had looked at her during dinner, the weight of his arm beneath her hand, that impossible statement in the corridor, "Or you're afraid of something else entirely." How did he know? How could he possibly know when she'd spent 3 years burying those feelings so deep she'd almost convinced herself they didn't exist? She rolled onto her side, pressing her face into the pillow with a muffled groan of frustration. This was precisely why she'd worn the hideous dress, to avoid this, to avoid the dangerous flutter in her chest every time his eyes found hers, the traitorous warmth that spread through her body when he spoke her name. She'd failed spectacularly. And now he was staying for a week, 7 entire days of this exquisite torture. By the time pale dawn light began filtering through her curtains, Georgiana had formulated a plan. She would avoid him, simple as that. Hartwell House was small compared to grand estates like Wycliffe Manor, but it was large enough for her to find excuses. Morning walks, visits to the village, sudden headaches that required rest in her chambers. Her father would be disappointed, But her father's disappointment was infinitely preferable to the alternative. The alternative being what, exactly? Falling deeper under the spell of a man who would leave in 7 days and forget her existence once again? No. Avoidance was the only logical course of action. She dressed quickly in a simple morning gown of pale blue muslin, pretty but practical, nothing like the monstrosity from yesterday, and slipped downstairs before the household fully awakened. If she could just escape into the gardens, she might have a few hours of peace before— "Good morning, Miss Hartwell." Georgiana froze at the bottom of the stairs, her hand still gripping the banister. Thomas stood in the open doorway to the breakfast room, backlit by morning sun that turned him into a study of light and shadow. He was dressed more casually than yesterday, no jacket, just shirt sleeves, and a waistcoat that hugged his frame in ways that made her mouth go dry. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it, and there was something softer about him in the morning light, something that made him look less like an untouchable duke and more like a man. A dangerously attractive man who was currently watching her with those impossibly blue eyes. "Your Grace?" She executed a small curtsy, stalling for time while her mind raced. "I wasn't expecting anyone to be awake yet." "I'm an early riser," he said, his mouth quirking in something that wasn't quite a smile. "A habit from my years in the military. It tends to disturb household staff when I wander about at dawn, so I've learned to fend for myself." He gestured to the breakfast room behind him. "I was just about to have tea. Would you care to join me?" Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to claim she'd already eaten, or that she had urgent business in the village, or that she'd suddenly developed the plague. But her treacherous mouth said, "That would be lovely, Your Grace." His expression shifted, surprise flickering across his features before settling into something that looked dangerously like pleasure. "Thomas," he said quietly, "when we're alone, I'd prefer you call me Thomas." The intimacy of the request stole the breath from her lungs. "That would be highly improper, Your Grace." "Yes," he agreed, still watching her with that unnerving intensity. "It would be." The unspoken invitation hung between them like a dare. Georgiana knew, absolutely knew, that she should refuse, should maintain the proper distance that society demanded, should protect herself from whatever this was building between them. Instead, she heard herself say, "Very well, Thomas." His name felt dangerous on her tongue, foreign and thrilling and wrong in all the best ways. Something flashed in his eyes, triumph, satisfaction, before he stepped aside, gesturing for her to precede him into the breakfast room. Georgiana moved past him, hyper-aware of the scant inches between them, the heat radiating from his body, the way her skirts brushed against his legs as she passed. The breakfast room was small and intimate, flooded with morning light from the tall windows overlooking the rose garden. Someone, likely Thomas himself, had already set out tea things and a simple breakfast of bread, cold meats and fruit. It was oddly domestic, seeing evidence of a duke preparing his own meal. "You really did fend for yourself," she observed, settling into a chair. Thomas took the seat across from her, close enough that she could see the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw, the way his throat moved when he swallowed. "I spent several years on campaign," he said, pouring tea with surprising grace. "One learns to appreciate self-sufficiency. Milk? Please." She watched his hands as he prepared her tea, strong, elegant hands that had probably held weapons and written letters, and other things she absolutely should not be thinking about. "I didn't know you served. Most people don't." He passed her the cup, their fingers brushing in the exchange. The contact sent electricity racing up her arm, and from the way his hand tensed, she knew he felt it too. "I purchased my commission young. Against my father's wishes, naturally. He thought it unbefitting a future duke. But you did it anyway." It wasn't a question. Thomas leaned back in his chair, cradling his own cup, his eyes never leaving hers. "I did. I wanted to be useful, to earn something through my own merit rather than simply inheriting it." His mouth twisted slightly. Naive, perhaps, but I was young. Georgiana found herself leaning forward, drawn in despite all her resolutions. "You speak as if you're ancient now." "You can't be more than 30. 29, he corrected, and there was something in his tone, a weariness that belied his years. but some experiences age you faster than time alone. She wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to understand this man who was nothing like the cold, distant duke she'd built up in her memory. But the intimacy of the moment already felt too dangerous, too close to something she couldn't afford to want. So instead she said, "Why are you really here, Your Grace?" The formal address felt like armor, a deliberate step back from the intimacy of his given name. Thomas noticed. She saw it in the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers tensed against his cup. "Thomas," he corrected gently, "and I told you, your father invited me." "My father invites many people. You're the Duke of Wycliffe. You could be anywhere, London, Paris, your estates. Why accept an invitation from an obscure country gentleman in Derbyshire?" The question hung between them, weighted with all the confusion and fear and desperate hope she'd been trying to suppress. Thomas set down his cup slowly, deliberately, his gaze never wavering from hers. "Because 3 years ago," he said quietly, "I met you at a ball, for approximately 30 seconds, and I've thought about you every day since." The world stopped spinning. Georgiana stared at him, certain she'd misheard, certain this was some elaborate jest or fever dream or— "That's impossible," she whispered. "You didn't even remember me. When my father introduced us yesterday, you acted as if we'd never met." I lied. The admission was simple, devastating. Thomas leaned forward, closing the distance between them, and she could see the tension in every line of his body. "I remembered you perfectly, Georgiana. Your green eyes. The way you smiled when you thought no one was watching. The small scar at your temple." His gaze flickered there briefly. "That you try to hide with your hair." Her hand moved involuntarily to her hairline, where a childhood fall had left its mark. "I don't understand." "Neither do I," he said, and there was something raw in his voice now, something vulnerable that made her chest ache. "I meet hundreds of people, attend countless balls and dinners. I should have forgotten you immediately. But I didn't, I couldn't. Then why—" Her voice cracked, and she had to swallow hard before continuing. "Why did you look through me that night? Why did you treat me like I was invisible?" Pain flashed across his features. "Because I was engaged." The words landed like a blow. Of course. Of course he'd been engaged. Men like Thomas Ashford didn't remain unmarried long. "I see," Georgiana said, proud of how steady her voice remained, even as something crumbled inside her. "Then I don't understand why you're here now. Surely your wife— She's dead." The flat statement hung in the air between them, brutal and final. Georgiana's breath caught. "I'm so sorry, I didn't—" "Don't." Thomas held up a hand, his expression hardening. "Don't apologize, it was complicated. We married 3 weeks after that ball. She died 6 months later. And before you ask, no, I didn't love her. It was a business arrangement between families. She didn't love me either. We were civil to each other, nothing more." The pain in his voice belied the clinical description. Whatever the truth of his marriage, it had cost him something. Left scars she could see, even if she couldn't fully understand them. "I still don't understand why you're here," she said softly. "What do you want from me, Thomas?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw him weighing his words, deciding how much truth to offer. Finally he said, "When your father's letter arrived, an invitation to visit, mentioning his daughter who loved to read, I knew it was you. I knew I shouldn't come, that it was madness to chase a memory from 3 years ago. But I had to see you again. I had to know if what I remembered was real or just—" He trailed off, searching for words. Just what? Her heart was hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Just a dream I'd built up to survive a nightmare." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "And now I'm here, and you're wearing hideous dresses and avoiding my eyes and looking at me like I'm going to hurt you. And I'm terrified that I've made a terrible mistake, that the woman I remembered doesn't exist, or that she exists but wants nothing to do with me." The vulnerability in his confession broke something open inside her. All her carefully constructed defenses, all her resolutions to protect herself, crumbled in the face of his raw honesty. "The dress was deliberate," she heard herself say. "I wore it to drive you away. Because I thought—" She had to force the words out. I thought you were just another suitor my father had dragged here. I didn't know it was you, and when you realized, Thomas prompted, leaning forward. Georgiana met his eyes, and for once she let him see the truth written on her face. When I realized it was you, I wanted to die. Because you were the man I'd cried over for weeks after that ball. The man I'd built up in my mind as perfect and unattainable. And I was standing there in the ugliest dress in England, and you were looking at me like you were the most fascinating woman I'd ever seen, Thomas finished softly. Because you were. You are. The words settled over her like a benediction, like a promise, like the beginning of something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. This is madness, she whispered. Yes, Thomas agreed. Complete madness. Neither of them moved. The morning light painted gold across the table between them, illuminating the tea growing cold. The breakfast neither of them had touched. Outside, birds sang in the rose garden, oblivious to the fact that Georgiana's entire world had just shifted on its axis. I don't know what happens next, she admitted. Thomas's mouth curved in something that was almost a smile. Neither do I. But we have 7 days to figure it out. 7 days. It sounded like forever and no time at all. Georgiana took a sip of her lukewarm tea, using the moment to steady herself. When she set the cup down, she found Thomas still watching her, patient and intense and impossibly present. Tell me about your estates, she said finally, grasping for safe ground. My father said something about drainage systems. Thomas laughed, actually laughed, and the sound transformed his face, made him look younger and less burdened. That's what you want to know about? Drainage systems? I find practical matters reassuring, she said primly, though she couldn't quite suppress her own smile. Very well. He settled back in his chair, still grinning. Let me tell you about the absolutely fascinating world of agricultural water management. And as he began to speak, his voice warm and animated, his eyes crinkling with amusement, Georgiana realized she was in more danger than she'd ever imagined. Because this wasn't the cold, distant duke from her memories. This was a man, a real, complicated, wonderful man, who looked at her like she hung the moon and laughed at his own absurdity and remembered a 30-second meeting from 3 years ago. This was a man she could very easily love if she wasn't careful, if it wasn't already too late. The next 3 days passed in a strange, suspended reality that felt nothing like Georgiana's ordinary life. Thomas was everywhere, at breakfast, in the library, walking the gardens when she sought refuge outdoors, and yet it never felt intrusive. He didn't crowd her or demand her attention. Instead, he simply existed in her space, as if he belonged there. As if he'd always been there, waiting for her to notice. They fell into a rhythm without planning it. Morning tea in the breakfast room, where they talked about everything and nothing, books and politics, and the absurdity of London society. Afternoons in the library, where they would read in companionable silence, occasionally sharing passages that struck them. Evenings when her father insisted on cards or music, and Thomas would watch her play the pianoforte with an expression that made her fingers stumble over the keys. It was terrifying. It was wonderful. And Georgiana knew, with increasing certainty, that it couldn't last. On the 4th morning of his visit, she woke to rain hammering against her window. The kind of relentless downpour that turned roads to rivers and trapped everyone indoors. She dressed in a simple gown of dove grey and made her way downstairs, expecting to find Thomas already in the breakfast room. Instead, she found her father alone at the dining table, sorting through correspondence with a distracted air. "Good morning, Father," she said, accepting a cup of tea from the housemaid. "Where is His Grace?" "Gone to the village." Her father didn't look up from his letters. "Some urgent business with his solicitor, apparently. He left before dawn." Something cold settled in Georgiana's stomach. The solicitor? But the roads? In this weather? He insisted. Her father finally glanced at her, and there was something calculating in his expression that made her uneasy. "He should return by afternoon, weather permitting. Which gives us time to speak, my dear." The way he said it, with that particular emphasis on the last 2 words, sent warning bells clanging through her mind. Georgiana set down her teacup carefully. "Speak about what, Father?" About his Grace's intentions, naturally. Her father folded his hands on the table, adopting what she privately called his serious business posture. He's been here 4 days now. 4 days of monopolizing your time, seeking your company at every opportunity. Surely you must realize what this means. Georgiana's chest tightened. It means he's a guest enjoying our hospitality. Don't be naive, Georgiana. Her father's voice sharpened. The Duke of Wycliffe doesn't spend 4 days at a modest country house for the scenery. He's courting you, and unless I'm very much mistaken, you've been encouraging him. Heat flooded her cheeks. I've done nothing improper. I'm not accusing you of impropriety. Her father's expression softened slightly. I'm merely observing that you seem fond of him, and he of you, which is precisely what I'd hoped when I extended the invitation. The words hit her like cold water. You planned this. You knew who he was when you invited him. Of course I knew. Her father looked genuinely surprised by her shock. Lord Pemberton mentioned that His Grace had inquired about you after the Havisham's ball 3 years ago, when he wrote to me last month, suggesting a visit. Well, I wasn't about to refuse such an advantageous connection. Georgiana stood so abruptly her chair scraped against the floor. He wrote to you. Thomas wrote to you asking to visit. Well, not in so many words. It was all very proper. Mutual acquaintances, business interests in the area, that sort of thing. But the subtext was clear enough. Her father studied her with narrowed eyes. Did you think this was coincidence, Georgiana? That a duke simply stumbled upon our doorstep? No, she hadn't thought it was coincidence. But she'd believed, foolishly, desperately, that Thomas had come for her. Because he'd remembered her. Because he'd wanted to see her again. Not because her father had orchestrated the entire thing like a chess match. I need air, she managed, already moving toward the door. Georgiana? Please, father. I need to think. She didn't wait for his response, didn't stop moving until she'd grabbed a shawl from the hall stand and stepped out into the covered walkway that led to the conservatory. Rain drummed on the glass roof above her head, creating a cocoon of sound that drowned out everything else. Had any of it been real? The conversations, the shared smiles, the way Thomas looked at her as if she were something precious and rare? Or had it all been part of some elaborate courtship ritual her father had engineered? I had to see you again, Thomas had said. I've thought about you every day since. But he'd also written to her father, had arranged this visit through proper channels, had played the game exactly as society dictated. Georgiana pressed her hands against the cool glass wall of the conservatory, watching rain stream down in rivulets. She should feel grateful, thrilled even. How many women had the chance to marry a duke who actually seemed to care about them, who made their hearts race and their thoughts scatter? But all she felt was hollow, because nothing she'd believed about the past 4 days was what she'd thought it was. I knew I'd find you here. Georgiana spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Thomas stood at the entrance to the conservatory, soaked through despite his greatcoat. Water dripped from his dark hair, ran down his face in small rivers. He looked like he'd ridden hard through the storm, and his eyes, those impossibly blue eyes, were fixed on her with an intensity that made breathing difficult. You're back, she said stupidly. Father said you wouldn't return until afternoon. I couldn't stay away. He moved into the conservatory, shrugging out of his wet coat. Underneath, his shirt clung to his frame, transparent in places where the rain had soaked through. Georgiana forced her gaze to his face. I finished my business and rode back immediately. The roads are nearly impassable. That was foolish. Yes. He took a step closer. I've been doing a lot of foolish things lately, coming here, staying, letting myself hope for things I have no right to hope for. Georgiana wrapped her arms around herself, the shawl suddenly insufficient armor against whatever was happening. My father told me you wrote to him, that you arranged this visit. Thomas went very still. He told you that? Yes. She lifted her chin, forcing herself to meet his eyes even though it hurt. Was any of it real, Thomas? Or was this all just her transaction? A duke in need of a wife, a country gentleman with a daughter to marry off. The pain that flashed across his face looked genuine, but then everything about him had seemed genuine. That was the problem. Is that what you think? His voice was low, rough. That I went through all this, tracking down your father's address, inventing excuses to visit, spending 4 days falling impossibly, irrevocably in love with you, because I needed a convenient wife. The words hung in the air between them, impossible and wonderful and terrifying. You're not in love with me, Georgiana whispered. You barely know me. I've known you for 3 years. Thomas moved closer, and she could see drops of rain clinging to his eyelashes, the tension in his jaw. Every night I went to sleep thinking about the woman with green eyes who looked at me like I was more than a title. Every morning I woke up wishing I'd been brave enough to speak to you properly at that ball, to ask your name, to request a dance, to do anything other than bow politely and walk away because I was engaged to someone else. Thomas, let me finish. He was close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from his rain-soaked body, could smell the scent of wet wool and leather, and him. Yes, I wrote to your father. Yes, I arranged this visit, because I'm a coward, Georgiana, because I was terrified that if I simply showed up at your door, you'd turn me away, so I hid behind propriety and social conventions and let your father think he was the one orchestrating everything. He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, his fingers brushed against her cheek with devastating gentleness. But nothing about the past 4 days has been a transaction, he said softly. Nothing about the way I feel when you laugh at my terrible jokes, or the way my heart stops when you play piano, or the way I lie awake at night in the guest room thinking about you sleeping just down the hall. None of that is part of any arrangement. Georgiana's breath caught. You can't say things like that. Why not? Because it's improper. Because we're not married. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, and she felt herself leaning into the touch despite every rational thought screaming at her to step away. I'm tired of hiding, Georgiana. I'm tired of pretending I don't want you with every fiber of my being. Want me for what? The question came out breathless, desperate. For a wife, for someone to manage your household and bear your children and for everything. The words were fierce, absolute. I want you as my wife, yes, but I also want you as my friend, my confidant, the person I tell my secrets to and share my dreams with. I want to wake up every morning knowing you're beside me. I want to argue with you about books and make you laugh and watch you play piano for the rest of my life. His hand cupped her face fully now, and Georgiana felt tears burning behind her eyes. This was everything she'd dreamed about, and everything she'd told herself was impossible, all tangled together in a moment too big to process. I'm scared, she admitted in a whisper. So am I. Thomas leaned forward until his forehead rested against hers, until she could count the raindrops on his eyelashes, until breathing meant sharing the same air. I'm terrified, Georgiana, because I've already lost one person I married. And the thought of losing you, of having you and then watching you slip away. His voice cracked, and Georgiana realized with shock that he was shaking. This powerful, untouchable duke was trembling against her like a man who'd reached the end of his endurance. What happened to her? She asked softly. Your wife. Thomas was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, childbirth. The baby didn't survive either. She was 6 months along when... He stopped, swallowed hard. It wasn't my child. She'd taken a lover. I knew, she knew I knew. But we'd both agreed to maintain appearances. And then she died. And everyone assumed I was the grieving husband when all I felt was guilt and relief and self-loathing for feeling relieved. The confession was raw, painful. Georgiana lifted her hands to his face, framing it the way he was framing hers. I'm sorry, she said. I'm so sorry you went through that. Don't be sorry. His eyes met hers, and she saw every scar, every wound he usually kept hidden. Be honest with me. Tell me if there's any chance, any at all, that you could feel for me even a fraction of what I feel for you, because if there isn't, I need to leave. I need to go before I make this worse. Georgiana looked at him, really looked at him, at the man who'd ridden through a storm to get back to her, who'd remembered her for 3 years, who was standing here soaking wet and vulnerable and asking for something she'd wanted since the moment she'd seen him 3 years ago. There's a chance, she whispered. More than a chance. The hope that blazed in his eyes was almost painful to witness. Georgiana. But I need time. She forced herself to say it, even as part of her scream to just surrender. This is all happening so fast. 4 days ago, I thought you'd forgotten I existed. Now you're telling me you love me, and I need time to think, to be sure. Thomas nodded slowly, though she could see the disappointment warring with understanding in his expression. How much time? The rest of your visit. She managed a shaky smile. You said we had 7 days. Give me the remaining 3 to sort through my feelings, and then... And then? His voice was hoarse. And then I'll give you my answer. It was both a promise and a reprieve. Thomas closed his eyes, his hands still cradling her face with infinite tenderness. 3 days, he repeated. I can do 3 days. He pressed his lips to her forehead, brief, chaste, but the contact sent shivers cascading down her spine. Then he stepped back, breaking the spell, leaving her cold where his warmth had been. I should change into dry clothes, he said, his voice carefully controlled, before I catch my death and rob you of the chance to break my heart properly. The attempt at humor made her smile despite everything. That would be inconvenient. Terribly inconvenient. He picked up his discarded greatcoat, but his eyes never left her face. Georgiana? Yes? Thank you. For being honest. For not just accepting out of obligation or fear or whatever reason women usually accept proposals from men they don't truly want. Is that what this was? She asked softly. A proposal? Thomas's mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. Not yet. But it will be in 3 days if you'll have me. The certainty in his voice, the absolute confidence mixed with vulnerability, made her chest ache in the best possible way. Go change, she said, before she did something foolish like pull him back to her. Before you turn into an ice sculpture. He laughed, the sound echoing off the glass walls of the conservatory. And then he left, water trailing in his wake, leaving Georgiana alone with the rain and her racing heart and 3 days to decide the rest of her life. The rain didn't stop. For 2 days, it fell in relentless sheets, turning the world beyond Hartwell House into a grey wash of water and mist. The roads became impassable, the village disappeared behind curtains of rain, and the household settled into a strange, suspended intimacy born of forced proximity. Georgiana spent those 2 days in a state of constant awareness. Every time she entered a room, her eyes sought Thomas first. By the window in the library, at the breakfast table with the Times spread before him, in the drawing room where her father attempted to teach him whist with limited success. And always she found him already looking at her. But he kept his distance, respectful, careful distance that somehow made her more aware of him than if he'd been standing beside her. He didn't push, didn't demand answers to the question hovering between them. He simply existed in her space, patient as stone, waiting for her to find her way to whatever answer lived in her heart. It was maddening, it was perfect, and it gave her far too much time to think. On the 6th morning of his visit, the second to last day before she owed him an answer, Georgiana woke to silence. The rain had stopped sometime in the night, leaving the world scrubbed clean and sparkling under weak morning sun. She dressed quickly in a walking gown of deep green and made her way downstairs, drawn by instinct to the library where she knew she'd find him. Thomas stood at the tall window overlooking the gardens, hands clasped behind his back, his dark silhouette framed by morning light. He'd heard her enter. She saw the slight tension in his shoulders, but he didn't turn around. The rain stopped, she said softly, moving to stand beside him at the window. Yes. His voice was neutral, carefully empty. The road should be passable by tomorrow. Tomorrow, the 7th day. The day she'd promised him an answer, the day he would leave, one way or another. Georgiana looked out at the gardens, at the roses bowing under the weight of rainwater, at the path that wound through carefully tended hedges toward the small folly at the edge of the property. She'd walked that path 1,000 times throughout her life, but somehow standing beside Thomas it looked different, full of possibility. Walk with me, she said suddenly. Thomas turned to look at her then, his blue eyes searching her face. Are you certain? No. She met his gaze steadily. But walk with me anyway. Something shifted in his expression, hope, carefully controlled. He offered his arm, and after only a moment's hesitation, she took it. They walked in silence through the house and out the garden door, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The morning air smelled of wet earth and roses, sharp and clean. Water dripped from leaves, catching the light like scattered diamonds. It should have been beautiful, it should have been peaceful, but Georgiana's heart was hammering so hard she could barely breathe. They reached the Folly, a small classical structure with white columns and a domed roof, and Thomas released her arm, moving to stand at the railing that overlooked the valley beyond. The storm had cleared the air, and she could see for miles, rolling hills, patches of forest, the distant glint of the river that marked the edge of Hartwell land. "I've made my decision," Georgiana said quietly. Thomas went very still. He didn't turn around, and she was grateful for that, grateful she didn't have to see his face when she said what came next. "I need you to understand something first," she continued. 3 years ago, when we met at that ball, I was 20 years old. I'd had my come out, attended dozens of social events, met countless men, and not one of them had ever made me feel anything beyond mild interest or polite boredom. She moved to stand beside him at the railing, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "And then I met you," she said softly. 30 seconds. That's all it was. But in those 30 seconds, you looked at me like I was a person, not a potential wife or a social connection or a decorative object, just a person worth noticing. And it destroyed me. Thomas's hands tightened on the railing, but he remained silent. "I went home that night and cried," Georgiana admitted, the confession painful even now, "because I knew I'd never see you again, because you were engaged and untouchable, and so far above my station that even hoping was foolish. So I buried it. I told myself it was infatuation, that I'd built you up in my mind into something you could never be." She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to continue. "And then you walked into my drawing room 4 days ago, and every defense I'd built crumbled to dust, because you weren't what I'd built up in my mind. You were better. You were real. You were kind and funny and vulnerable, and everything I'd dreamed about and nothing I'd expected." Finally, Thomas turned to look at her. His face was a study in careful control, but his eyes betrayed him. She could see the fear there, the hope, the desperate need for whatever words came next. "I'm terrified," Georgiana whispered. "I'm terrified of how much I feel for you after only 6 days. I'm terrified of what it means to marry a duke, to leave everything I know and enter a world I don't understand. I'm terrified of your grief, of the shadows I see in your eyes when you think I'm not looking. I'm terrified that I'm not enough, that I'll never be enough, to make you truly happy." "Georgiana." His voice was rough, breaking. "But I'm more terrified," she continued, cutting him off, "of living the rest of my life wondering what if, of always looking at that moment in the drawing room as the time I was too afraid to reach for something extraordinary." She turned to face him fully, lifting her chin even as tears burned behind her eyes. "So yes, Thomas, if you're still asking, if you still want me despite all my fears and doubts and complete inexperience with your world, yes. My answer is yes." For one suspended heartbeat, nothing happened. Thomas simply stared at her as if he couldn't quite process what she'd said. And then he moved. His hands came up to cup her face with devastating gentleness, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized had fallen. His eyes searched hers, looking for doubt, for hesitation, for any sign she didn't mean it. "Say it again," he demanded hoarsely. "I need to hear you say it again." "Yes." The word came out stronger this time, more certain. "Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll be your duchess. Yes to everything you asked for in the conservatory. Wife and friend and confidant and—" He kissed her. Not tentatively, not carefully. He kissed her like a man who'd been holding back for 6 days and had finally reached the end of his endurance. His lips claimed hers with a hunger that stole her breath, that made her knees buckle, that sent heat cascading through her body like wildfire. Georgiana gasped against his mouth, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders. Whether to push him away or pull him closer, she wasn't certain. His arms wrapped around her waist, drawing her against the solid strength of him, and she could feel his heart hammering against her chest, could taste desperation and relief and something darker on his lips. It was nothing like the chaste kisses she'd imagined, nothing like the gentle romance in novels. This was raw and real and overwhelming in the best possible way. When he finally pulled back, breathing hard, his forehead resting against hers, they were both trembling. "I'm sorry," he said roughly. "That was too much. I shouldn't have—" "Don't apologize." Georgiana's fingers curled into the fabric of his coat, holding him in place. "Don't you dare apologize for that." A sound escaped him, half laugh, half groan. "You're going to be the death of me, Georgiana Hartwell." "Georgiana Ashford," she corrected softly. "Soon." His arms tightened around her, and she felt him shudder. "Georgiana Ashford," he repeated, as if testing the sound. "My Duchess, my wife, you're everything," she whispered against his throat. "If you'll let me be." Thomas pulled back just enough to look at her, and what she saw in his eyes made her chest ache. Joy, pure incandescent joy, mixed with a vulnerability that spoke of every wound he'd ever carried. "I don't deserve you," he said quietly. "I know I don't, but I promise, I swear to you, Georgiana, I will spend every day of the rest of my life trying to be worthy of what you're giving me." "You already are." She lifted one hand to his face, tracing the line of his jaw, feeling the slight roughness of morning stubble against her palm. "You already are, Thomas. You just don't know it yet." He turned his head to press a kiss to her palm, his eyes closing as if the simple touch was almost too much to bear. When he opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. "When?" he asked. "How soon can we marry? I know there are proprieties, arrangements to make, but—" "As soon as possible," Georgiana interrupted, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I don't want to wait. I don't want months of engagement and endless planning and time for doubt to creep in. I want to marry you soon." "A special license?" Thomas's mind was already working. She could see it in his expression. "I can obtain one within the week. We could be married by the end of the month." The end of the month. Less than 4 weeks away. It should have terrified her, and part of it did, but mostly she felt relief, as if a decision long delayed had finally been made. "My father will want a proper wedding," she warned. "I don't care." Thomas's hand slid down to her waist, holding her as if she might disappear. "We can have whatever wedding you want, grand or simple, in a cathedral or a village church, as long as at the end of it, you're my wife." Simple, Georgiana decided. The village church, just family and close friends. Nothing elaborate. Perfect. He smiled then, truly smiled, and it transformed his face, made him look younger and less burdened. "You're perfect." "I'm not." She shook her head, needing him to understand. "I'm going to make mistakes, Thomas. I'm going to stumble through my duties as Duchess. I'm going to say the wrong thing at important dinners and probably offend half of London society without meaning to." "I'm counting on it," he said seriously. "London society needs offending. They've grown complacent." Despite everything, despite the enormity of what she'd just agreed to, Georgiana laughed. "You're impossible." "I'm yours." He said it simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "For better or worse, in all my impossible glory, I'm yours, Georgiana." The words settled over her like a vow, like a promise that would be made official in a few short weeks, but was already binding in every way that mattered. "We should go back," she said reluctantly. "Tell my father. Make plans. In a moment." Thomas pulled her close again, tucking her head under his chin, his arms wrapped around her like he was sheltering her from the world. "Just let me hold you for a moment. Let me convince myself this is real." Georgiana relaxed into his embrace, feeling the steady thrum of his heartbeat beneath her cheek, the solid strength of him surrounding her. This was real. This impossible, wonderful, terrifying thing was actually happening. She was going to marry the Duke of Wycliffe. She was going to become Georgiana Ashford, Duchess of Wycliffe. She was going to leave behind everything familiar and step into a world she barely understood. But she wouldn't be doing it alone. She'd be doing it with Thomas, complicated, wounded, wonderful Thomas, who looked at her like she hung the moon and kissed her like she was air and water and everything necessary for survival. "Thomas," she said softly. "Hmm?" I think I might love you." The confession came out barely above a whisper, but she felt him go rigid against her. "I know it's too soon. I know I should wait to be certain. But I think I started falling in love with you 3 years ago, and I've been falling ever since." For a long moment he didn't respond. Then his arms tightened around her almost painfully, and she felt moisture against her hair. "I know I love you," he said, his voice wrecked. "I've known since the moment you walked into that drawing room wearing that hideous dress and looking at me like I'd ruined your life. I love you, Georgiana, desperately, completely, forever, forever." It was a promise and a prayer and everything she'd ever wanted wrapped in a single word. "Forever," she repeated, testing the weight of it. "I can do forever." "Good." Thomas pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Because I'm not letting you escape now. You're stuck with me, future Duchess." "Future Duchess," she echoed, and this time the title didn't feel quite so terrifying. "I suppose I should start practicing my regal wave." He laughed, deep and genuine and full of joy, and the sound of it filled something inside her she hadn't realized was empty. They stood there in the folly for long minutes, holding each other as morning sun warmed the air and birds sang in the gardens below. The world waited for them, announcements to make, arrangements to complete, a future to build together. But for now they had this, a moment of peace in the eye of the storm, a moment where nothing existed except the two of them and the promise they'd made. And it was enough. It was everything. Her father took the news exactly as Georgiana had expected, with barely contained triumph and immediate plans for grandeur. "Her Duchess!" he exclaimed, clasping Thomas's hand with such enthusiasm that Georgiana worried for the Duke's circulation. "My daughter, a Duchess. This calls for champagne. Mrs. Henderson," he bellowed for the housekeeper, "break out the French champagne. The good vintage, not the one we serve at Christmas." "Father, please," Georgiana protested, her cheeks burning. "It's barely noon." "Noon? Midnight? What does it matter?" Her father was practically dancing around the drawing room. "This is the best news I've had in 20 years. Better than when old Hartwell died and left me this estate. Better than—" "Perhaps we should discuss the arrangements," Thomas interjected smoothly, though Georgiana could see amusement crinkling the corners of his eyes. "The timeline, the ceremony itself." That sobered her father slightly. He settled into his favorite chair, suddenly all business. Of course. You'll want a proper engagement period. 6 months should suffice. Time to announce it properly in the papers, host an engagement ball in London." 3 weeks, Thomas said firmly. Her father blinked. "I beg your pardon?" 3 weeks. I'll obtain a special license. We'll marry in the village church with immediate family and close friends only." Thomas's hand found Georgiana's, his fingers lacing through hers with possessive certainty. "Neither of us wants an elaborate affair." But the scandal," her father sputtered. "People will talk. They'll say you're marrying in haste because—" He stopped abruptly, his face reddening as he realized what he was about to imply. "Let them talk." Thomas's voice was ice. "Anyone who suggests impropriety about my future wife will answer to me personally, and I assure you, sir, that is not a conversation they'll enjoy." The quiet menace in his tone sent a shiver down Georgiana's spine. This was the Duke speaking now, not the gentle, vulnerable man who'd held her in the folly. This was the aristocrat who commanded estates and influenced Parliament and could destroy reputations with a word. It should have frightened her. Instead, she felt oddly protected. Her father, reading the steel in Thomas's expression, wisely changed tactics. "Very well, 3 weeks it is. But you must at least allow me to host a small dinner party, to introduce His Grace properly to our neighbors and—" "No." Georgiana surprised herself with the firmness of her refusal. Both men turned to look at her. "No dinner parties, father. No announcements until after we're married. I don't want to spend the next 3 weeks being stared at and gossiped about." "But my dear, she's right." Thomas squeezed her hand gently. "We'll marry quietly. Afterwards we can host a reception at Wycliffe Manor if you wish. But for now, let's keep this between us." Her father opened his mouth to argue further, thought better of it, and closed it again with visible effort. "As you wish, Your Grace, though I reserve the right to tell at least Lord Pemberton. He'll never forgive me if I don't gloat at least a little. The man's been trying to marry off his own daughter to a duke for years. One person, Thomas conceded, but make clear that the information is not to be shared further. Of course, of course. Her father was already standing, clearly eager to rush off and spread the news, despite his promise of discretion. I should write to the vicar. And we'll need to discuss settlements, Your Grace. The marriage contract. My solicitor will handle everything, Thomas said. He'll call on you tomorrow to discuss terms. You'll find them more than generous. The words were polite, but Georgiana heard the subtext. This is happening with or without your approval. Don't make it difficult. Her father heard it too. He nodded, suddenly subdued. Very good, Your Grace. I'll leave you two to talk then. Plans to make, I'm sure. He left with uncharacteristic haste, and Georgiana found herself alone with Thomas in the sudden silence. I'm sorry, Thomas said immediately. I should have been more diplomatic with him. But the thought of waiting months, of parading you through London society like a prize to be won, his jaw clenched. I couldn't bear it. Neither could I. Georgiana moved closer, drawn by the tension radiating from him. But 3 weeks, Thomas. That's so soon. Are you certain? I've never been more certain of anything. He pulled her into his arms and she went willingly, resting her head against his chest. Every day I wait is a day something could go wrong. Your father could change his mind. You could realize you're making a terrible mistake. Society could interfere. I'm not going to change my mind, she interrupted softly. Promise me. His arms tightened around her, almost painfully. Promise me, Georgiana. Because I don't think I could survive losing you now. The raw fear in his voice broke her heart. She pulled back just enough to look up at him, seeing the shadows that always lurked behind his eyes, shadows she was only beginning to understand. I promise, she said firmly. In 3 weeks I'll stand in that church and marry you. And nothing, not society, not doubt, not fear, will stop me. Some of the tension eased from his frame. He cupped her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone with achingly gentle precision. I don't deserve you. Stop saying that. She caught his hand, holding it against her cheek. You keep acting like I'm some grand prize you've won through trickery. But Thomas, I chose you, I chose this, and I'll keep choosing it every day for the rest of our lives. He kissed her then, softer than before, but no less devastating. A kiss that tasted of promise and possession, and something deeper that she didn't have words for yet. When they broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. I have to leave. The words hit her like cold water. What? Just for a few days. He was already pulling away, and she could see the regret etched into every line of his face. I need to return to London. Obtain the special license, arrange for my solicitor to handle the settlements, close up the townhouse. I'll be living primarily at Wycliffe Manor after we marry. How long? Georgiana tried to keep the panic from her voice and failed miserably. 4 days. 5 at most. His hands slid down her arms to capture her hands, holding tight. I'll leave at first light tomorrow and ride straight through, and the moment everything is arranged, I'll come back for you. 4 days without him. 4 days to second-guess and doubt and wonder if any of this was real. As if reading her thoughts, Thomas pulled her close again. Don't, he said fiercely. Don't let the doubts in while I'm gone. Trust this. Trust us. I'm trying. She pressed her face against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of him. Leather and soap and something uniquely Thomas. It's just so fast, so overwhelming. I know. His hand stroked through her hair, the gesture soothing. But fast doesn't mean wrong, Georgiana. Sometimes the best decisions are the ones we make without thinking ourselves out of them. Is that what you did? Made this decision without thinking? No. He pulled back to meet her eyes. I've been thinking about this decision for 3 years. I just finally had the courage to act on it. 3 years, the same amount of time she'd been carrying him in her heart, trying to convince herself he was just a foolish dream. 4 days, she said, making it sound like a vow. I'll wait 4 days, and then you'd better come back for me, Thomas Ashford, or I'll hunt you down myself. He laughed, surprised and delighted. Fierce. I like it. My Duchess should be fierce. Your Duchess, she repeated, testing the words again. They still didn't feel quite real. I'm going to be terrible at it, you know. I'll probably insult important people and forget proper protocols and you'll be perfect, he finished. Perfectly yourself, which is all I've ever wanted. They spent the rest of the afternoon together, walking the gardens, sitting in companionable silence in the library, stealing kisses in empty corridors like adolescents. Her father wisely made himself scarce, likely already composing the letter to Lord Pemberton that would set the gossip mill churning. Dinner was a quiet affair. Her father attempted conversation several times, but gave up in the face of the tension crackling between Georgiana and Thomas. The knowledge that he was leaving at dawn hung over them like a physical weight. When the evening finally ended, and they stood at the base of the stairs, the same stairs where she'd stood 6 days ago, terrified to meet her father's mysterious guest, Thomas caught her hand one last time. "Sleep well," he said softly. "Liar." She managed a shaky smile. "Neither of us will sleep tonight." "Probably not." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that sent heat racing up her arm. "But we can pretend." 4 days, she reminded him. 4 days, he agreed. And then forever. Forever. The word should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like coming home. Georgiana didn't sleep. She lay in her bed watching moonlight paint patterns across her ceiling, her mind racing through everything that had happened. In less than a week, her entire life had been turned upside down. She was engaged to a duke. She would be leaving Hartwell House, the only home she'd ever known. In less than a month, she would become a duchess, with responsibilities and duties she barely understood, and she would be Thomas's wife, his partner, his everything, as he'd called her. The thought sent equal parts terror and exhilaration cascading through her chest. A soft knock on her door made her sit up in bed. "Yes?" Mary entered, carrying a candle, her expression troubled. "Miss, forgive me for disturbing you, but there's a woman downstairs asking to speak with His Grace. She says it's urgent." Georgiana's stomach clenched. "What woman?" "She wouldn't give her name, miss, but she's very insistent, and she looks—" Mary hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "She looks like quality, if you understand me, not someone we can simply turn away." Every instinct screamed danger. But Georgiana forced herself to remain calm. "Where is His Grace?" "In the library, miss. Your father went to bed an hour ago." "Of course he did." Georgiana threw back her covers, reaching for her dressing gown. "I'll handle it." "Miss, you can't go down in your night clothes." "I can and I will." She tied the robe securely, her jaw set. "If someone is here to see the Duke at midnight, I want to know why." Mary looked like she wanted to argue but knew better. Instead, she simply handed Georgiana the candle and followed her down the stairs like a worried shadow. The library door was ajar, and through the gap, Georgiana could hear voices. Thomas's low and controlled, and another voice, female, cultured, angry. "Think you can simply forget, Thomas? Forget what we meant to each other?" Georgiana's blood turned to ice. She pushed the door open fully, and 3 pairs of eyes turned toward her. Thomas stood by the fireplace, his expression carved from stone. And facing him, beautiful, elegant, and looking at him with naked fury, stood a woman Georgiana had never seen before, a woman who clearly knew Thomas very, very well. "Forgive the intrusion," the woman said, her tone dripping with false sweetness as her gaze swept over Georgiana's nightclothes with obvious disdain. "But I needed to speak with the Duke, privately." "Anything you need to say to me," Thomas said coldly, "you can say in front of my fiancé." The word hung in the air like a bomb. The woman's eyes widened, then narrowed. "Fiancé? You move quickly, Your Grace. It's barely been a year since Catherine died." Georgiana felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. She gripped the doorframe for support, her mind reeling. This woman had known Thomas's wife, which meant she knew about his marriage, about his grief, about parts of his life he hadn't shared with Georgiana yet. "Lady Ashworth," Thomas said, his voice like winter frost, "I suggest you leave, now, before you say something we'll all regret." But Lady Ashworth was smiling now, a sharp, predatory smile that made Georgiana's stomach churn. "Oh, but Thomas, doesn't your little country bride deserve to know the truth? About you and Catherine, about what really happened that night. Get out." The command was deadly quiet. "No." The woman turned to face Georgiana fully, and there was cruelty in her beautiful eyes. She should know what kind of man she's marrying. She should know that— "Enough!" Thomas moved between them, blocking Lady Ashworth from Georgiana's view. "You will leave my future wife out of whatever twisted game you're playing. You will leave this house, and you will never, never approach either of us again. Do you understand?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Finally, Lady Ashworth laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "She doesn't know. Oh, this is rich. You haven't told her anything, have you, Thomas?" "Mary," Georgiana said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded, "please escort Lady Ashworth to her carriage." "There's no need," Lady Ashworth said. "I'm leaving. But mark my words, Miss—" She paused, waiting for Georgiana to supply her name. "Hartwell," Georgiana said, lifting her chin. "Georgiana Hartwell, soon to be the Duchess of Wycliffe." Something flickered in Lady Ashworth's eyes. Respect, perhaps, or calculation. "Well then, Miss Hartwell, I wish you luck. You're going to need it." She swept from the room, leaving devastation in her wake. The silence in the library was deafening. Georgiana stood frozen in the doorway, her candle trembling in her hand, watching Thomas's rigid back as he stared into the fireplace. The tension radiating from him was palpable. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the white-knuckled grip of his hands at his sides, the careful, measured breaths he was taking as if trying to maintain control. "Thomas," she said softly. He flinched at the sound of his name. "You should go back to bed, Georgiana." "No." She set the candle down on a nearby table and closed the door, shutting Mary out, shutting the world out. "Not until you tell me what just happened." "It's nothing." His voice was flat, empty. "Lady Ashworth is a bitter woman with too much time and too many grievances. Ignore her. She knew your wife." The words hung between them like accusation. Thomas's shoulders tensed further, if that was even possible. "Yes," he admitted finally. "She knew Catherine." "How?" Georgiana moved closer, drawn despite the warning bells clanging in her mind. "How did she know her?" Thomas was silent for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then slowly he turned to face her. What she saw in his expression made her chest ache, pain and shame and a bone-deep weariness that aged him beyond his years. "Lady Ashworth was Catherine's closest friend," he said quietly. "They grew up together, were practically sisters. And when Catherine married me, Lady Ashworth made it very clear that she believed I was unworthy of her." Georgiana processed this, her mind working through implications. "She was in love with you." "No." Thomas shook his head. "She was in love with the idea of Catherine marrying someone she approved of, someone she could control. I was neither of those things." What did she mean about that night? The question emerged before Georgiana could stop it. What really happened the night Catherine died? Thomas closed his eyes and she watched something break inside him. When he opened them again, they were haunted, the shadows she'd glimpsed before now fully visible in the firelight. "I told you Catherine died in childbirth," he said slowly. "That's true, but I didn't tell you all of it." Georgiana waited, her heart hammering. Part of her didn't want to know, didn't want whatever darkness he was about to reveal. But if she was going to marry this man, she needed to know all of him, not just the gentle parts he showed her, but the wounded, complicated reality beneath. "Catherine hated me," Thomas said bluntly. "From the moment we married, she made that abundantly clear. We had separate chambers, separate lives. The only time we interacted was at social functions where appearances had to be maintained. And that," his voice caught, "that was fine with me. I didn't love her either. I'd gone into the marriage with no illusions." He moved to the sideboard, pouring himself a measure of brandy with shaking hands. He didn't drink it, just held it like an anchor. "The child wasn't mine," he continued. We hadn't—" He stopped, clearly struggling with how to explain without being indelicate. "The marriage was never consummated, by mutual agreement. So when she told me she was expecting, we both knew whose child it was." Georgiana's breath caught. Her lover. Lord Ashworth. Lady Ashworth's husband. Thomas's laugh was bitter. "Ironic, isn't it? Catherine took up with her best friend's husband. And when he refused to leave his wife for her, Catherine tried to pass the child off as mine, demanded I claim it publicly. What did you do? I agreed. The admission came out flat, resigned. What else could I do? The scandal would have destroyed both our families, so I agreed to claim the child, to let society believe it was mine, to play the doting father-to-be. And Catherine seemed almost grateful. For a few weeks we had something approaching civility between us. He finally took a sip of the brandy, grimacing at the burn. Then she went into labor 2 months early, he said quietly. I was in London, attending to business. By the time I received word and rode back to the estate, she'd been laboring for nearly a day. The doctor said the baby was positioned wrong, that she was too weak, that... His voice broke completely. He set down the glass before he dropped it, his hands trembling. She died calling for him, Thomas whispered. For Ashworth. Not for me, not for the doctors, not even for Lady Ashworth, who was there holding her hand. She died calling for a man who'd abandoned her the moment the affair became inconvenient. Georgiana felt tears burning behind her eyes. She moved to him without thinking, closing the distance between them, her hands finding his. I'm so sorry, she said. Thomas, I'm so sorry you went through that. Don't. He tried to pull away, but she held firm. Don't pity me, Georgiana. I don't deserve it. Because when she died, when I stood there watching the life drain from her eyes, all I felt was relief. Relief that I was free. That I wouldn't have to spend the rest of my life in that cold, empty marriage. That doesn't make you a monster, Georgiana said fiercely. It makes you human. Lady Ashworth would disagree. His laugh was hollow. She blamed me for Catherine's death. Said if I'd been a proper husband, Catherine wouldn't have needed to seek affection elsewhere. Said I killed her through neglect. That's absurd. Is it? Thomas met her eyes, and the anguish there stole her breath. I married a woman I didn't love because it was expected. I maintained a facade of civility while letting her suffer in loneliness. Maybe if I'd tried harder, been kinder, given her some reason to... Stop. Georgiana cupped his face, forcing him to look at her. Catherine made her choices. You made yours. Neither of you was blameless, but neither of you was wholly at fault. Marriage without love is always complicated, always painful. But Thomas... She made sure he was listening, really listening. You cannot carry the guilt of her choices for the rest of your life. How can I not? The question came out broken. How can I marry you knowing I failed so spectacularly with her, knowing that I'm bringing all this darkness, all these ghosts, into your life? Because I'm not Catherine. Georgiana said it firmly, with absolute certainty. I'm not marrying you out of obligation or family pressure. I'm choosing you, Thomas, knowing about your past, knowing about your grief and your guilt and your shadows. I'm choosing all of it. You shouldn't. But even as he said it, his hands came up to cover hers, holding her palms against his face like they were the only thing anchoring him. You should run as far from me as possible. Well, I'm terrible at following sensible advice. She managed a shaky smile. Always have been. Just ask my father. Despite everything, a sound that might have been a laugh escaped him. Georgiana, I need to know one thing, she interrupted, and I need you to be completely honest with me. He nodded, bracing himself. Do you want to marry me out of guilt? She forced herself to ask it, even though the answer terrified her. Are you trying to fix what happened with Catherine by choosing differently this time? No. The answer was immediate, vehement. God, no. Georgiana, you're not some redemption project. He struggled for words, his hands tightening over hers. You're the first person in years who's made me feel like I'm more than my title, more than my mistakes. You look at me and see Thomas, not the Duke of Wycliffe with all his tragic history. That's because you are Thomas, she said softly. The man who reads novels and makes terrible jokes and rides through storms to get back to me. That's who I'm marrying, not your ghosts. They come with me, he warned. The ghosts. They always will. Then we'll learn to live with them. She pulled his hands away from her face, lacing their fingers together. Together. Because that's what marriage is, isn't it? Not two perfect people finding each other, but two imperfect people choosing to face imperfection together. Thomas stared at her as if she'd just spoken in a foreign language. How are you so wise at 23? I'm not wise. Georgiana rested her forehead against his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her cheek. I'm terrified, but I'm also certain. Does that make sense? Perfect sense. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her close. I don't deserve you, Georgiana Hartwell. Stop saying that, she murmured against his shirt, or I'll start listing all your flaws to prove you're just as human and undeserving as everyone else. I have flaws. He sounded almost amused now. Terrible ones. You're brooding. You carry guilt like a shield. You think far too much. I think you might be describing yourself, he interrupted gently. She pulled back to glare at him. I am not brooding. You wore the ugliest dress in England specifically to repel me. If that's not brooding, I don't know what is. Despite everything, despite Lady Ashworth's intrusion and the heavy conversation and the weight of Thomas's past settling over them, Georgiana laughed. That was strategic, not brooding. Strategic brooding, Thomas corrected, and she could hear the smile in his voice. The worst kind. They stood there in the firelight, holding each other, and Georgiana felt something shift, not just between them, but inside her own chest. This was real. The ghosts and the scars and the complicated history, all of it was real, and she was choosing it anyway. You're still leaving tomorrow, she said, not a question. Yes. Thomas pressed a kiss to the top of her head. But I'll come back. 4 days, Georgiana. And then nothing, not Lady Ashworth, not the past, not anything will keep us apart again. Promise? I promise. He pulled back to look at her, his expression serious. And I promise something else. I will never lie to you. I will never hide parts of myself because I think you can't handle them. You deserve honesty, even when it's ugly. Good, she managed a tired smile. Because I'm going to hold you to that. And I promise the same. No secrets, no hidden parts. Just us, however complicated that is. However complicated, he agreed. They stood there for another long moment, neither wanting to break the spell. Finally, Georgiana pulled away reluctantly. I should go back upstairs before Mary sends a search party. Or before your father wakes up and finds you in my library in your nightclothes. Thomas's eyes crinkled with amusement. That would be quite the scandal. The Duke of Wycliffe, compromising innocent young ladies in libraries. Georgiana headed for the door, then paused to look back at him. I can see the headlines now. There's only one innocent young lady I'm interested in compromising, Thomas said, his voice low and warm, and I have to wait 3 more weeks to do it properly. The heat in his gaze sent shivers down her spine. Georgiana grabbed her candle before she did something foolish, like run back to him. 4 days, she reminded him from the doorway. 4 days, he confirmed. And then I'm never letting you out of my sight again. It sounded like a threat and a promise all at once. Georgiana carried it with her up the stairs, clutching it close like a talisman against the darkness. 4 days. She could survive 4 days, and then forever would begin. Thomas left at dawn, just as he'd promised. Georgiana watched from her bedroom window as he mounted his horse in the pale morning light, his greatcoat billowing in the wind. He looked up once, as if he knew she'd be watching, and their eyes met across the distance. Even from here, she could see the reluctance in every line of his body, the way his hands tightened on the reins, as if he were physically restraining himself from dismounting and coming back inside. Then he turned the horse toward the road and rode away, disappearing into the mist that clung to the valley like smoke. Georgiana pressed her palm against the cold window glass, feeling the absence of him like a physical ache. 4 days. Just 4 days. It felt like an eternity. The first day passed in a blur of forced normalcy. Her father was insufferable, already planning elaborate announcements despite their agreement to keep things quiet, drafting letters to relatives Georgiana barely remembered, talking incessantly about the prestige of having a duchess in the family. She let his words wash over her without really listening, her mind hundreds of miles away with a dark-haired duke riding toward London. She tried to read but couldn't focus on the words, tried to practice piano, but her fingers felt clumsy on the keys. tried to walk in the gardens, but everything reminded her of Thomas. The folly where they'd stood together, the path they'd walked, the roses he'd admired. By evening, she was exhausted from the effort of pretending everything was fine. "You're moping," her father observed over dinner, his tone caught between amusement and concern. "I am not moping." Georgiana pushed food around her plate without eating it. "I'm simply quiet. You're lovesick." He said it with satisfaction, as if he'd orchestrated the entire emotion himself. "It's quite charming, actually, very romantic." Georgiana set down her fork with more force than necessary. "Father, if you gloat one more time about how clever you were in arranging this, I'm going to scream. But I was clever. You were manipulative. There's a difference." She softened the words with a small smile. "Though I suppose I should thank you, even if your methods were questionable." Her father beamed. "So you admit I did well?" "I admit that Thomas is unexpected and wonderful, and I'm terrified." The confession slipped out before she could stop it. "Father, I'm absolutely terrified." The gloating expression faded from her father's face, replaced by something gentler. "That's natural, my dear. Marriage is a significant step, especially to someone of His Grace's station." "It's not his station that frightens me." Georgiana stared at her untouched plate. "It's how much I feel for him after such a short time. What if it's not real? What if I'm confusing infatuation with love? What if—" "Georgiana." Her father reached across the table to pat her hand awkwardly. "I may be a meddling old fool, but I'm not blind. I've seen the way you look at each other. That's not infatuation. That's the real thing." "How can you tell?" "Because you look at him the way your mother used to look at me." His voice went soft with memory, like he's the answer to a question you didn't know you were asking, like he makes the world make sense. Tears burned behind Georgiana's eyes. She blinked them back furiously. "I miss her. Mother would know what to say right now. She'd say what I'm saying, that you've found something rare. Don't question it to death, Georgiana. Sometimes the best things in life are the ones we don't overthink." It was, quite possibly, the most wisdom her father had ever imparted. Georgiana squeezed his hand gratefully. "Thank you, Father." "You're welcome." He cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the emotion. "Now eat something. You're going to waste away before the wedding, and then what will I tell His Grace?" The second day was harder. Georgiana woke with a gnawing sense of unease she couldn't quite name. She went through the motions of her morning routine, dressing, breakfast, attempting to read in the library. But everything felt wrong, off-kilter, as if the world had tilted slightly sideways and she was the only one who'd noticed. By afternoon, the unease had crystallized into full-blown anxiety. What if Thomas changed his mind? What if being back in London reminded him of all the reasons this was a terrible idea? What if Lady Ashworth found him there and poisoned his thoughts against Georgiana? What if the special license was denied? What if— "Miss Georgiana, you're going to wear a hole in that carpet." Mary's voice broke through the spiral of catastrophic thoughts. Georgiana stopped pacing and realized she'd been walking the same path across the library floor for who knew how long. "I'm being ridiculous," she said aloud. "You're being in love," Mary corrected gently. "It's not the same as being ridiculous, though sometimes it looks similar." Despite herself, Georgiana smiled. "When did you become so wise about love, Mary?" "I've been reading your novels when you're not looking." Mary's eyes twinkled. "Very educational they are." That surprised a genuine laugh from Georgiana. "You're reading my novels?" "Someone has to make sure they're appropriate for a young lady." Mary sniffed primly, though her expression remained amused. "And besides, they help pass the time when you're busy mooning over dukes." "I am not mooning." Georgiana stopped, caught the look on Mary's face, and laughed again. "Fine, I'm mooning. Is it that obvious?" "Miss, you've checked the window for riders approximately 30 times today, and it's only 3 o'clock. Had she? Georgiana hadn't even realized she was doing it. He's not due back for 2 more days. Doesn't stop you from looking. Mary moved to straighten books that didn't need straightening. "If you don't mind me saying, miss, His Grace is coming back. I saw the way he looked at you before he left. That's not a man who's going to change his mind." "How can you be sure?" "Because I've been in service for 20 years, miss. I've seen dozens of courtships, engagements, marriages, and I've never seen a gentleman look at a lady the way His Grace looks at you. Like your air and water and everything necessary for life. The words, so close to Georgiana's own thoughts from days before, settled something inside her chest. The anxiety didn't disappear completely, but it eased, became manageable. Thank you, Mary. You're welcome, miss. Now why don't you go for a proper walk? Clear your head. Stop wearing holes in expensive carpets. It was sensible advice. Georgiana grabbed her shawl and headed outside, letting the cool air chase away the cobwebs of worry. The third day brought a letter. Georgiana recognized Thomas's handwriting on the envelope immediately, bold, decisive strokes that somehow perfectly matched his personality. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. My dearest Georgiana, London is exactly as terrible as I remembered. Grey and noisy and full of people I have no interest in seeing. I've spent 2 days being subjected to congratulations from acquaintances who barely remember my name, enduring questions about my sudden engagement and fending off Lady Ashworth, who apparently believes she can change my mind through sheer persistence. She cannot. Nothing could. The special license has been obtained. My solicitor assures me all the settlements are in order and will call on your father tomorrow to finalize everything. I've closed the townhouse and made arrangements for staff at Wycliffe Manor. Everything is ready. Everything except me. I'm not ready to be apart from you for another moment. I'm leaving London at first light tomorrow, a day earlier than planned. I cannot bear to wait any longer. By the time you read this, I'll already be on the road back to you. 3 days felt impossible when I left. Now that I've spent them missing you with every breath, I realize I was right to insist on a short engagement. Every hour apart from you feels like a small death. Too dramatic? Perhaps. But it's the truth. You've ruined me for solitude, Georgiana Hartwell. Made me need your presence like I need air. I'm not certain whether to thank you or curse you for it. I choose thanks, always thanks. I'll see you tomorrow, my love. And then I'm never leaving your side again. Yours eternally. Thomas. Georgiana read the letter 3 times, clutching it like a lifeline. He was coming back. Tomorrow. A whole day early. The anxiety that had been knotting her stomach for 3 days finally released. She pressed the letter against her chest, feeling her heart race with anticipation rather than fear. One more day. Just one more day. She could survive that. The 4th day dawned clear and bright. Georgiana woke before sunrise, too excited to sleep. She dressed with unusual care, not in her finest gown, but in the pale blue muslin she'd worn the first morning she and Thomas had breakfast together. The morning everything had changed. She was in the library by the time the sun crested the horizon, pretending to read but actually watching the window. Waiting. Her father found her there at noon. Still no sign of him? No. Georgiana tried not to sound as disappointed as she felt. But the roads from London are long. He'll be here. Of course he will. Her father settled into his favorite chair. The man rode through a storm to get back to you 4 days ago. He's not going to let good roads slow him down now. It was meant to be comforting. It was. But as the afternoon wore on with no sign of Thomas, the old anxieties began creeping back. What if something had happened? What if his horse had thrown a shoe? What if he'd been set upon by highwaymen? What if... Miss Georgiana! Mary burst into the library, her cap askew, her face flushed with excitement. He's here! His Grace just rode up. But Georgiana was already moving. The book forgotten, propriety forgotten. She ran through the house and out the front door just as Thomas was dismounting. He saw her, and his face transformed. That careful ducal composure he usually wore shattered completely, replaced by pure joy. Georgiana? She didn't let him finish. She threw herself at him with complete disregard for who might be watching, and he caught her. Of course he caught her, his arms coming around her waist to lift her clear off the ground. You're early, she said breathlessly against his shoulder. I couldn't wait. His voice was rough with emotion. 4 days was 3 too many. She pulled back just enough to look at him. He looked tired. There were shadows under his eyes, stubble on his jaw, his hair disheveled from the wind. He looked absolutely perfect. I missed you, she admitted. So much it hurt. Good. His hands tightened on her waist. I want you to miss me when I'm gone. Want you to feel even half of what I feel when you're not with me. It's not a competition, Thomas. Isn't it? His smile was crooked, exhausted, utterly beautiful. Because if it is, I'm winning. I've been miserable for 4 days straight. Then we're tied, she said. I've been equally miserable. Perfect. We can be miserable together from now on. That's a terrible foundation for a marriage. Then we'll build a better one. He set her down carefully but didn't release her, his hands remaining at her waist as if he couldn't bear to let go. Starting now. Starting with this. I love you, Georgiana. I should have said it in the letter, but I wanted to say it to your face. I love you. Completely. Irrevocably. Forever. The words wrapped around her heart like a benediction. I love you too. I think I have since the moment you told me novels teach empathy, or maybe since you kissed me in the Folly, or possibly since 3 years ago when you bowed to me at that ball. I'm not sure when it started, but I'm sure it's never going to end. Thomas made a sound, half laugh, half something that might have been a sob, and pulled her close again, his face buried in her hair. 1 more week, he murmured. 1 week, and you'll be my wife. 1 week, she agreed. Are you ready? I've been ready for 3 years. He pulled back to look at her, his eyes serious despite the smile playing at his lips. The real question is, are you ready? Georgiana looked at him, this complicated, wonderful, wounded man who'd ridden for days to get back to her, who'd been honest about his scars, who looked at her like she was everything. Yes, she said simply. I'm ready. And for the first time since he'd left, the certainty settled into her bones like truth. This was real, this was right, and in 1 week it would be forever. The week before the wedding passed in a strange combination of endless waiting and time moving far too quickly. Thomas stayed at the village inn. Propriety demanded it, much to both their frustration, but he spent every daylight hour at Hartwell House. They walked the gardens until Georgiana could navigate every path with her eyes closed. They sat in the library reading passages aloud to each other. They had tea in the breakfast room and talked about everything and nothing until the words ran out and comfortable silence took their place. And through it all, Georgiana learned him. The real him, beneath the title and the carefully maintained composure. She learned that he took his tea with too much sugar and always forgot to eat breakfast unless someone reminded him. That he had a scar on his left hand from a childhood mishap involving a fence and a particularly angry goose. That he spoke French fluently but couldn't carry a tune to save his life. That he read poetry when he thought no one was watching, his lips moving silently over the words. She learned that he was funny, genuinely, unexpectedly funny in a dry, self-deprecating way that caught her off guard and made her laugh until her sides ached. That he had strong opinions about architecture and weaker ones about fashion. That he missed his mother, who died when he was 17, with a quiet grief he rarely voiced but carried in the careful way he spoke of her. And she learned that he loved her, not in grand gestures or flowery declarations, but in the small things. The way he always walked on the side of the path closest to the road, subtly protecting her. The way his eyes sought her out when he entered a room, as if confirming she was still there. The way he listened when she spoke, truly listened, as if her words were important, as if she was important. It terrified her and thrilled her in equal measure. 3 days before the wedding, they sat in the Folly at sunset, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to deep purple. Tell me about Wycliffe Manor, Georgiana said, breaking the comfortable silence. I should know something about my new home before I arrive. Thomas was quiet for a moment, his fingers absently tracing patterns on the stone railing. It's old, built in the 15th century, renovated extensively in my grandfather's time. Too large for one person, really. I've been rattling around in it like a ghost for the past year. Cheerful, Georgiana observed dryly. He smiled, despite himself. I suppose it sounds grim, but it's beautiful, Georgiana. The main house overlooks a lake. There are gardens designed by Capability Brown himself. A library that puts your fathers to shame. stables full of horses you'll love, staff who are probably placing bets on whether I'd ever remarry. What odds did they give? I don't want to know. He turned to look at her, his expression softening. But they'll love you. My housekeeper, Mrs. Chapman, has already been planning menus and arranging your chambers. Yes, separate chambers, propriety and all that. Though I should warn you, the Duchess's suite connects to the Duke's through a shared sitting room. Heat crept up Georgiana's neck at the implication. I see. Very convenient for morning tea, Thomas continued, his tone perfectly innocent, but his eyes dancing with amusement. And discussions about estate business. And, Thomas. She swatted his arm, laughing despite her embarrassment. Stop. I'm simply being practical. But he was grinning now, looking younger and less burdened than she'd ever seen him. Though, if you'd prefer I wall up the connecting door— Don't you dare! The words came out more forcefully than she'd intended. Thomas's grin widened into something that made her stomach flutter. So noted, future Duchess. They sat in silence again, but it was charged now, humming with awareness of what came after the wedding, of the reality of marriage that they'd both been carefully not discussing, despite its inevitability. I'm nervous, Georgiana admitted quietly. About the wedding? About after. She forced herself to meet his eyes. About the parts of marriage I don't understand, that no one explains properly to sheltered country girls who spend too much time reading novels. Understanding dawned in Thomas's expression. He shifted closer, taking her hand in his. Georgiana, listen to me, I'm nervous too. She blinked. You are? Terrified. His thumb stroked over her knuckles. My first marriage was a disaster. We barely spoke, let alone— He stopped, clearly uncomfortable. And now I'm marrying you, someone I actually care about, someone I love, and I'm terrified of doing something wrong, of hurting you, or frightening you, or— You won't. She squeezed his hand. I trust you, Thomas. You shouldn't. But he was smiling slightly. Not blindly anyway, promise me something? Anything. Promise me you'll tell me if I do something you don't like, if I move too fast or say the wrong thing, or just promise me you'll be honest, even if it's uncomfortable. The earnestness in his voice made her chest ache. I promise, but you have to promise me the same thing. We're both going into this without much of a roadmap. Deal. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. We'll figure it out together, make our own roadmap. That sounds terrifying. It does, doesn't it? His eyes crinkled. But at least we'll be terrified together. You make terror sound romantic. Only with you. He pulled her closer, and she went willingly, resting her head on his shoulder as the last light faded from the sky. Only with you, Georgiana. 2 days before the wedding, Lady Ashworth returned. Georgiana was in the morning room going over seating arrangements with her father when Mary appeared, her face pale. Miss, that woman is here again. Lady Ashworth, she's demanding to see you this time. Georgiana's stomach clenched. Where's Thomas? At the inn, miss. He left an hour ago to change for dinner. Of course. Lady Ashworth had chosen her moment deliberately. I'll see her, Georgiana said, ignoring her father's protest. In the drawing room. Alone. Georgiana, I don't think— Father, please. This is something I need to handle myself. She found Lady Ashworth standing by the fireplace, examining a portrait of Georgiana's late mother with critical eyes. She was as beautiful as Georgiana remembered, golden hair artfully arranged, gown perfectly fitted, every inch the aristocratic lady, and looking at Georgiana with barely concealed contempt. Miss Hartwell, Lady Ashworth said, her voice dripping false courtesy. How kind of you to see me. Lady Ashworth, Georgiana kept her voice level, I assume you're not here for a social call. How perceptive. The older woman's smile was sharp. No, I'm here to deliver a warning. Woman to woman, as it were. I don't need your warnings. Don't you? Lady Ashworth moved closer, her eyes hard. You're marrying a man haunted by ghosts. A man who destroyed my best friend through neglect and indifference. A man who will do the same to you, given half a chance. Anger flared hot in Georgiana's chest. Thomas didn't destroy anyone. Your friend made her own choices, as did he. Their marriage was complicated. Complicated? Lady Ashworth laughed bitterly. Is that what he told you? That it was complicated? Did he tell you that Catherine begged him to love her? That she tried everything to earn his affection, and he gave her nothing but cold civility? That's not... Did he tell you how she cried? Lady Ashworth's voice rose. How she spent nights alone knowing her husband couldn't bear to even look at her. How she turned to someone else because Thomas made her feel invisible. The words hit like physical blows. But Georgiana forced herself to stand firm, to remember what Thomas had told her, the truth beneath the accusations. Catherine had an affair, Georgiana said quietly. She carried another man's child. Whatever pain she felt, she made choices that hurt Thomas too. They were both trapped in a loveless marriage, both suffering. You can blame Thomas all you want, but it won't change the fact that your friend played her part in that tragedy. Lady Ashworth's face went white. How dare you? No, how dare you? Georgiana took a step forward, surprising herself with her own courage. You barge into my home, insult my future husband, and act as if Catherine was some innocent victim. But marriage takes two people, Lady Ashworth. Two people who both made mistakes. And yes, Thomas carries guilt for his part. But he's not the monster you're trying to paint him as. You're a fool, Lady Ashworth spat. A naive little fool who thinks love will be enough. But it won't. The shadows will always be there. Catherine will always be there between you. A ghost he can never escape. Then we'll live with her ghost. Georgiana lifted her chin. Thomas and I. Together. Because that's what marriage is, facing the ghost together instead of alone. For a moment something flickered in Lady Ashworth's eyes. Pain, raw and real beneath the anger. I loved her, she whispered. Catherine. She was like a sister to me. And I watched her die calling for a man who abandoned her. I can't let Thomas just move on as if she never mattered. Understanding crashed over Georgiana like a wave. This wasn't really about Thomas. It was about grief. About a woman who'd lost her best friend and needed someone to blame. She mattered, Georgiana said more gently. Thomas knows she mattered, but Lady Ashworth, she's gone. And the living have to keep living, even when it hurts. Lady Ashworth stared at her for a long moment. Then, without another word, she turned and swept from the room. Georgiana stood there shaking, listening to the sound of a carriage pulling away. She'd done it. She'd faced down the ghost of Catherine and survived. When Thomas arrived for dinner an hour later, she told him everything. He listened silently, his expression unreadable. I'm sorry, he said finally. I should have been here. You shouldn't have had to face her alone. I wanted to. Georgiana took his hands. She needed to know that I'm not afraid of your past, that I'm choosing you anyway, all of you. Thomas pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. One more day, he murmured against her hair. One more day and you're mine, legally forever, and I'm never letting you face anything alone again. One more day, she agreed, and this time the wait didn't feel endless. It felt like standing on the edge of something beautiful, looking down at forever spread out below. Tomorrow would be her wedding day. Tomorrow she would become Georgiana Ashford, Duchess of Wycliffe. Tomorrow forever would begin. She was ready. Georgiana woke on her wedding day to rain. Not the violent storm that had trapped them indoors a week ago, but a soft, steady drizzle that turned the world silver. She lay in bed listening to it tap against her window, feeling strangely calm, as if all the anxiety and fear and doubt of the past weeks had finally burned themselves out, leaving only certainty in their wake. Today, she would marry Thomas. Today, everything would change. Mary arrived with tea and found her already dressed in her shift, staring out the window at the grey morning. It's raining, Georgiana observed. Rain on a wedding day is good luck, miss. Mary set down the tray and began laying out the wedding gown, a simple creation of ivory silk that Georgiana's mother had worn 25 years ago. Means fertility and blessings. Or it just means England has terrible weather, Mary smiled. That too. Now sit. We have much to do and only 3 hours to do it. The next hours passed in a blur of preparation. Mary dressed Georgiana's hair in soft curls, threaded with tiny white rosebuds from the garden, applied just enough rouge to bring color to her pale cheeks, helped her into the gown, which fit as if it had been made for her despite the decades between. When Georgiana finally looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The woman staring back was elegant, poised, radiant with something that might have been happiness or terror, or both tangled together. Her mother's pearls gleamed at her throat. Borrowed, because Mary insisted every bride needed something borrowed. Her grandmother's ring sat on her right hand, something old. The wedding gown itself was old as well, which Mary said counted double. Something new? Georgiana asked. Mary produced a delicate lace handkerchief, embroidered with Georgiana's new initials, GAA. Georgiana Ashford, Duchess of Wycliffe. His Grace sent it this morning, Mary said softly, with a note. Georgiana's hands trembled as she unfolded the small card tucked with the handkerchief. For tears of joy, I hope. Though I'll understand if they're tears of panic at what you've agreed to. I'll be the one at the altar trying not to pass out from nervousness. See you soon, my love. T. She pressed the handkerchief to her lips, feeling tears prick behind her eyes. I'm not going to cry, she announced. Of course not, miss. Mary's own eyes were suspiciously bright. But just in case, you should probably tuck that somewhere accessible. The village church was small and plain, but someone, likely Thomas, had filled it with flowers. White roses and ivy climbed the stone pillars. Candles flickered despite the morning light filtering through stained glass windows. The pews held perhaps 20 people. Her father's closest friends, a few distant relatives, Thomas's solicitor, and his housekeeper, Mrs. Chapman, who'd travelled from Wycliffe Manor. And Thomas. He stood at the altar with his back to the door, speaking quietly with the vicar. He wore a coat of deep blue that made his shoulders look impossibly broad, his dark hair carefully combed for once, his posture rigid with tension. Georgiana's father offered his arm and she took it, her bouquet of white roses trembling in her other hand. "Ready, my dear?" he asked softly. Yes. And she was, terrified and exhilarated, and absolutely certain. "I'm ready." The church organ began to play, a simple melody, nothing grand, and Thomas turned. The expression on his face when he saw her walking down the aisle would stay with Georgiana for the rest of her life. Wonder, disbelief, joy so pure and raw it was almost painful to witness. His hands clenched at his sides, his throat working as if he were fighting for control, and she saw the shimmer of moisture in his eyes. He was crying. The Duke of Wycliffe was standing at the altar in front of witnesses, crying at the sight of her. Georgiana felt her own tears threaten and remembered the handkerchief tucked in her sleeve. She'd definitely be needing it. She reached the altar, and her father placed her hand in Thomas's. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid and shaking slightly. "You're beautiful," he whispered, just for her. "The most beautiful thing I've ever seen." "You're not supposed to talk yet," she whispered back. "Can't help it." His thumb stroked over her knuckles. "Been waiting 3 years to tell you that." The vicar cleared his throat pointedly, and Thomas finally looked away from her, though his hand never loosened its grip. The ceremony passed in fragments, words about love and commitment until death do us part. Thomas's voice, steady and sure, promising to love and cherish and honor. Her own voice, somehow not shaking, promising the same. The cool weight of a gold band sliding onto her finger, matching the one she slid onto his. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the vicar said, his voice echoing off stone walls. "You may kiss your bride, your grace." Thomas turned to her, and for one suspended moment they simply looked at each other. Husband and wife, Duke and Duchess, two people who'd found each other against all odds and chosen to leap into forever together. "Hello, wife," Thomas said softly. "Hello, husband," Georgiana replied. And then he kissed her. Not the desperate kiss from the folly, not the careful, proper kiss of two people still learning each other. This was a kiss of promise, of homecoming, of two souls recognizing they'd finally found where they belonged. When they broke apart, the small gathering was applauding. Georgiana barely heard them. She was too focused on Thomas's face, on the joy written in every line of it, the tears tracking openly down his cheeks now, the smile that looked like it might never fade. "We did it," he said, wonder coloring his voice. "You're actually mine now." "We're each other's," she corrected. "That was the whole point." "Right. Yes, each other's." He was still smiling like a fool, and Georgiana realized she was matching him. "Forever." "Forever," she agreed. The wedding breakfast was held at Hartwell House, a simple affair of food and wine and toasts that made Georgiana blush and Thomas laugh. Her father gave a rambling speech about destiny and granddaughters he hoped to meet soon. Mrs. Chapman, who'd taken an immediate liking to Georgiana, promised that Wycliffe Manor was ready to welcome its new duchess. But through it all, Georgiana was aware only of Thomas beside her, his hand on her back as they cut the cake, his quiet laughter at her father's jokes, the way he kept looking at her as if confirming she was real, as if afraid she might disappear if he looked away. Finally, mercifully, the breakfast ended, and Thomas's carriage appeared to take them to Wycliffe Manor. There were hugs and tears and promises to visit soon. Her father pressed a kiss to her forehead and whispered, "Be happy, my dear. You deserve it." And then they were alone in the carriage, rain pattering on the roof as they pulled away from the only home Georgiana had ever known. Thomas pulled her against his side immediately, as if the brief separation during the farewells had been too long. "Are you all right?" "I think so." Georgiana rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. "Ask me again in an hour when the reality sets in." "Fair enough." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "We can take this as slowly as you need, you know. There's no rush. We have forever to figure everything out." "Forever," Georgiana repeated, and the word no longer frightened her. It simply was, a fact as immutable as sunrise. "That's going to take some getting used to." "We'll get used to it together." Thomas's arms tightened around her. "Everything together from now on. I meant those vows, Georgiana, every word." "So did I." She pulled back to look at him, taking in the face she would wake up to for the rest of her life. "I love you, Thomas. Complicated past and ghosts and all. I love you too." His hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch infinitely gentle. "Thank you." "For what?" "For wearing that hideous dress. For giving me a chance. For being brave enough to say yes, even when you were terrified. His voice caught. "For saving me from a life of loneliness I didn't even realize I was living until I met you." Georgiana felt tears slip down her cheeks, happy tears this time, the kind Mary had predicted. "That handkerchief you gave me. I'm definitely going to need it." Thomas laughed and produced his own handkerchief, gently wiping away her tears. "I came prepared, been carrying one for myself all morning in case I broke down during the vows." "You did cry," she pointed out. "I know." "Couldn't help it." He wasn't embarrassed, just honest. "Seeing you walk down that aisle, knowing you were choosing me, that I got to keep you, it was overwhelming. Good overwhelming. The best overwhelming." He kissed her softly. "The only overwhelming I ever want to feel." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, watching the countryside roll past through rain-streaked windows. The storm was already clearing, weak sunlight breaking through clouds, painting everything gold. "Tell me something," Georgiana said eventually. "That first night you arrived at Hartwell House when I came into the drawing room wearing that awful dress, what were you really thinking?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering. "I was thinking you were even more beautiful than I remembered, that the dress couldn't hide it, couldn't hide you, and I was terrified that I'd made a terrible mistake in coming. That you'd take one look at me and remember the cold stranger from 3 years ago and tell me to leave." "I almost did," Georgiana admitted. "Tell you to leave, I mean. I was so convinced you'd forgotten me, that I was nothing to you." "You were everything," he said simply. "You are everything. And now you're my wife, and I get to spend the rest of my life proving it to you." The carriage slowed, and Georgiana realized they'd arrived. Through the window she caught her first glimpse of Wycliffe Manor, and Thomas had been right. It was beautiful. Grey stone turned silver in the rain, vast windows reflecting clouded sky, gardens stretching in every direction despite the season. "Welcome home, Duchess," Thomas said softly. Home. Not Hartwell House, but this place she'd never seen before. This manor that would be hers to manage, to live in, to make her own. It should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt like possibility. "Show me everything," she said, turning to him with a smile. "I want to see all of it, our home." The joy that blazed in Thomas's eyes was answer enough. He helped her from the carriage, and despite the rain and propriety, and the staff lined up to greet their new Duchess, he swept her into his arms. "Thomas," she laughed, clinging to his neck. "Put me down, you're making a scene." "Let me make a scene." He carried her toward the entrance, grinning like a madman. "I'm carrying my bride over the threshold, it's tradition." "You're ridiculous." "I'm happy," he corrected, pausing at the threshold to look down at her. "For the first time in years, Georgiana, I'm genuinely, completely happy, and I don't care who knows it." He kissed her there in the doorway, in front of the assembled staff and the grey sky and the whole world. A kiss that tasted of rain and promise and new beginnings. And when he finally carried her inside, into the grand entrance hall with its soaring ceiling and marble floors, and the future stretching out before them, Georgiana realized something fundamental had shifted. She wasn't afraid anymore. Not of being a duchess, not of Thomas's past, not of the enormous leap she'd taken. Because this, being in his arms, seeing that smile on his face, knowing they'd chosen each other freely and completely, this was worth every moment of fear that had come before. "Forever starts now," Thomas murmured against her hair. Georgiana looked around at the manor that was now her home, at the husband who was now her partner, at the life they would build together. "Then let's not waste a single moment of it," she said. And as Thomas set her down gently, his hand finding hers with the ease of long practice despite their new marriage, Georgiana Ashford, Duchess of Wycliffe, stepped into her future, into forever, into home. 1 year later, Georgiana stood at the window of the Duchess's sitting room, watching Thomas in the garden below. He was attempting to teach their new puppy, a gift from her father, to sit, with limited success. The puppy kept jumping up to lick his face, and even from here she could see Thomas laughing. His formal ducal composure completely abandoned. A year. They'd been married for a year. It had been the hardest, most wonderful year of her life. Learning to manage a household this size. Navigating London society with its unspoken rules and judgment. Facing the whispers about their hasty marriage, and the ghost of Catherine that still occasionally haunted the edges of their happiness. But they'd faced it together, just as they'd promised, and somewhere along the way the manor had stopped feeling like Thomas's home and become theirs. The ghosts had faded. The future had become present. Thomas looked up as if sensing her watching and waved, his smile visible even at this distance. The puppy took advantage of his distraction to steal his hat and race away, and Georgiana laughed at the undignified chase that followed. Her hand moved unconsciously to her stomach, where the smallest flutter of new life was just beginning to make itself known. She hadn't told him yet, was waiting for the perfect moment. But soon she would tell him that their family was growing, that the manor would have an heir, that their forever was expanding in the most beautiful way. Thomas appeared in the doorway, disheveled and grinning, the puppy squirming in his arms. "Your father's gift is a menace." "Your heir is a menace," Georgiana corrected, smiling. "But we love him anyway." "True." Thomas set down the puppy, who immediately began investigating the furniture. "Though I question the wisdom of naming him Duke. Very confusing when the staff tries to summon me." "You'll adapt." She moved into his arms and he held her close, swaying slightly as if to music only they could hear. "Have I told you today that I love you?" he murmured. "Only 3 times. You're slipping. Unacceptable. I love you." He kissed her forehead. "I love you." Her nose. "I love you." Her lips, soft and lingering. "I love you too," Georgiana said against his mouth. "And Thomas?" "I have something to tell you." And as she whispered the news and watched joy and wonder and love cascade across his face, Georgiana knew with absolute certainty that every moment of fear, every doubt, every terrifying leap into the unknown had been worth it. Because this life they'd built together, was more than she'd ever dared to dream. This was everything. This was forever. and it was only just beginning.